Hello, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. So today we're going to talk about dealing with Dr. Google. This is something that I know I am not alone in struggling with in the past, something that I've heard a lot from colleagues, from coaching clients, from various places on social media where clinicians gather to vent about things that stress them out about their job. And so I wanted to create an episode that was specifically about this topic. So what you can expect in this podcast, first is to talk about why this is difficult, why we struggle with this, why it is hard when our patients come in and they've already done a deep dive on Google or whatever. This isn't like a Google slam. It's just that that's literally the search engine that everyone uses. What I mean is, patients come in and they say, I know I wasn't supposed to look it up, but I looked it up, right? That whole thing. And then what that can elicit in us. So just talking a bit about that. Then I'm going to talk about the strategy that I use to not let this sink our appointment, so I don't make it wrong, first of all, that I have any kind of negative reaction to my patient coming in, having Googled, having researched, but I do use specific strategies that help me to still stay connected with the patient and to still have a productive, successful visit with them. And so that's what I want to share with you. Beyond the reasons why we struggle, I'm going to talk about the strategies that I use in the room, which include acknowledging why and understanding better why the patient Googled, what to do about the possibility of anchoring bias that Googling can create, what to do if actually what they Googled was useful and helpful, but more importantly, what to do if what they Googled does not actually end up matching your assessment of the situation, and some strategies you can use to still stay connected and in good relationship with your patient, despite the fact that now there's this difference of opinion that in part Google may have created. So if that sounds good, keep listening. All right. So as a start, why is the Dr. Google phenomenon challenging for us? I was reflecting on why this is so hard for us in the room to accept. And I think there's multiple pieces. And so as you listen, I invite you to reflect what makes my patients Googling about their medical care hard for me, and I would include in here, so, times where patients Google their symptoms and then have a suspected diagnosis, times where patients Google possible treatments and then feel worried or anxious about, especially like the possibility of side effects is a very common one. What is it about when they start bringing up, like, listen, I know it's so funny. Patients understand that clinicians are conflicted about this phenomenon as well, because it's so common. My patients be like, I know I wasn't supposed to Google. I know I shouldn't have Googled, but, and then they like launch into why they Googled. Honestly, those ones I find, because I have that awareness, it is a lot easier to use the strategies I'm going to describe. The ones that I do find more challenging is when they're like, I've done my research and I'm here to tell you what I know that you don't know. Like when they really, don't have the awareness that this could create more challenges with us trying to move forward together. And so especially in those cases, what comes up for me is a few things. So like one is, I do think that a lot of us got into medicine, got into healthcare because we wanted to have the answers. If I think about myself personally, I always did very well in school. And I will be honest, I loved raising my hand and having the answer. I loved, even like I'm a little bit of a nightmare to play a trivia game with or a board game with. I love knowing the answer and like that dopamine rush of like, oh, I know what's going on. And I think it's important to acknowledge, if you happen to be a similar personality type to me or have that similar phenomenon of you get a bit of a rush from having the answer and knowing it, and having other people ask you for the answer feels really good. And I think a lot of us went into healthcare because we wanted to be kind of the knowledge keepers, the knowledge havers, and to give it to other people. And I think that's what a lot of us think of when we think of how we help people. And so honestly, like a little bit of this is just like the patient lets the air out of the balloon for us. Like they already have the answer. They already have the spoiler at the end of the movie, if you will. And so then it's like, oh, I wanted to tell you that, I don't think that's all the time, but I do think that's a part of it. So just reflect if that might be something that's true for you. I've realized over the years that's something that can be true for me. And the way I know that is if there's a time where someone comes in and they haven't Googled anything, and then I just have what seems like a much more straightforward, like, they're like, what do you think it is? And then they give you all the, symptoms and you do your assessment. And you're like, well, I think it's this. And they're like, wow, thank you so much. Like I still get that dopamine rush. I'm like, oh, this is like maybe what the doctors used to feel like before Google, where they just like got this all the time, And so I just acknowledge that that's part of it is it changes a little bit of what we're doing if we're not the only ones with the knowledge. And I've already explained and will explain through this podcast why I think ultimately that is a very good thing. And it's good news for us that we don't have to have all the answers and all the knowledge. But sometimes that's why it makes it hard when people do the Dr. Google, There's this emotional reward to being seen as an expert. And then especially it gets a little more icky or frustrating or whatever that word is, that kind of like resentment feeling might creep in. I hear the word almost disrespect. Like sometimes clinicians perceive like you don't trust me to know the answers. You had to Google it yourself. Like sometimes we can get, if ego is the word that's useful for you, or, like we get a bit of, hey, you're taking away my identity. You're not respecting that I'm the clinician and I have the answers and you don't. Like we start to feed a little into that need for our identity to include having the knowledge and being the knowledge keeper and the expert in the room. We feel devalued of having that respect that we thought we would gain by being in healthcare and being clinicians. And so I say all that in a really descriptive way, certainly not a judgmental way, because I certainly recognize that in myself. And that makes it hard when someone comes in with Google, right? And so something to acknowledge, just to notice if that's what's a piece of what's happening for you in the room, and just like noticing that that's causing some extra layers of disconnection and distance from your patient that ultimately won't serve if your job is to be there to be connected and figure out what's going on with this patient. So another thing that I think happens that makes it hard when Dr. Google comes in the room is we can be put in a position where we have to disagree with a patient. So like that heart sink feeling when someone says, I've done my research, and then they proceed to share what is in your brain and my brain one of the really strange and twisted and really detrimental, like kind of conspiracy theory stuff that's out there, that is very meaningful for the patient, but we go, oh no, this is like not going to go well. And I mean, certainly through this pandemic, we have experienced a lot of that, whether it was around the vaccines, whether it was around if COVID is real. Like if you had any patients in your practice that, were saying like, I don't want blood transfusions because they could have the COVID vaccine, right? Like there was levels of misinformation, disinformation that continue to be out there, and that we saw sort of smack us right in the face with the pandemic. That meant, if someone comes in and you're like, hey, have you thought of the vaccine? And then the person's like, well, I've done my research and I've read a lot about it. And then your heart sinks being like, oh no, is this going to be one of those conversations? And part of it is that disrespect, expert keeper, maybe, but also if you're like me and you, have sort of social conditioning, personal experience, reasons to fear conflict, to fear disagreement, to feel uncomfortable saying no or disagreeing with someone, and especially with a patient where you want to try and be connected with them and be agreeable with them and be helpful to them. And so now this is going to create conflict. And depending on your personal views or your personal experience and your bodily reaction to conflict, this could make this feel like a more like dangerous charge situation for you. It certainly has for me. And so then that can make I've done my research, I've done my Google piece of the conversation feel like, oh no, is this going to be a fight? It feels scary. So there's that reason too. And then the last reason is this risk of anchoring bias, which I mentioned in the summary at the top. So this anchoring bias being this idea of like, whatever idea is introduced first, often then we are prone to thinking that must be the truth, right? So in a completely different context, like say two people are negotiating a price, like they're negotiating a price over like how much a car will cost, like one person trying to buy a car from the other, like whoever initiates the price first, that ends up being like the anchor. And so then the other person feels compelled to try and make their offer match a bit closer. And so this is true in with patients as well. So if a patient comes in and says, I think I need an MRI, we've skipped a bunch of steps, and now it's all going to be about if you need an MRI or not. And that means that we can miss critical symptoms that the patient used in their assessment that they need an MRI that may have led us in a different direction. And I have certainly experienced this. I've had patients come in and they think, I think my old condition is back again because I have pain in a similar place. And that can be very time efficient if it ends up being true. I have had one case in particular I could think of where we went down that road, and I'm not sure, honestly, that if I asked different questions, it would have had a different outcome. But certainly, I noticed my bias of it must be this again, and it ended up being something different. And it took way longer to diagnose that other thing because I had been anchored, and I anchored myself in what the patient brought to me as their hypothesis, right? And so it's just like another like mental thing that if the patient kind of comes in fresh and just says, here are my symptoms, here's what's going on, we may not have then that anchoring bias because they haven't introduced, I think it might be this, right? So patients aren't doing this on purpose, of course, and that's what we're going to talk about, but those are challenges, right? So part of the reason that we dread or feel that heart sink or groan sensation in our body when someone's like, okay, I've done a Google, is this is going to make this encounter harder. And that can make it harder to accept. Then we can go on rants about like why, medicine's going to hell in a handbasket because everyone's Googling, and who are we anymore? Are we just McDonald's medicines? Like, you can get into a bit of a rant about that. And by the way, feel free, all feelings welcome here. I totally get it. It does mean, though, that every single time someone mentions Google in the room, we have this really negative, as in this really painful, draining reaction. And then that makes our job harder, right? And so at least accepting the reality that Google is here to stay and really just like acknowledging like, okay, this is something that we do just need to develop a strategy around because it's just a fact of life, right? Before the pandemic existed and before literally like COVID existed, we didn't have to have strategies or knowledge around COVID, but now we do. And same with Google, like Google exists, the internet exists. Whether we think it is good or bad is kind of irrelevant because here it is, right? And so how can we instead move forward instead of fighting reality, because then that just makes it even harder, right? So like in the moment with patients, feel free internally, maybe externally with the patient, but certainly internally, like pausing and saying, I wish they hadn't Googled this time. I'm noticing that this is making making it harder for my brain to really focus on the big picture. I'm noticing I'm getting anxious about possible conflict. Oh, I really wish that they hadn't Googled this time. I'm feeling like it makes my job harder, and that is valid. It's okay for me to feel frustrated or irritated or resentful. All feelings are welcome. So just offering yourself that real sort of soothing, accepting the reality of what's happening, including the reality of your emotions about Google. They're happening. They're here. And Google exists. People are going to Google. I Google all the time. Of course, and when it's up to us and it's like us in our personal lives, we love Google. I use it all the time. It's like the portal to all knowledge. It's kind of amazing, right? And so the thing I want to bring into the balance is there are times where Google can really helps me. Like I Google in front of my patients things that I'm like, you know what? I want to double check this factor. I'm not sure. Or, oh, you're bringing me a treatment I'm not aware of. Let's Google it together. Like I use it to my benefit and to my patient's benefit. So how can I understand my initial reaction when it feels painful, but also how can I practice shifting that reaction over time to have a more at least neutral or fulsome understanding of what Google can mean to me in my practice, right? Because this job is hard enough without making this a thing I'm mad at my patient for doing, right? That's the thing. Like if it's getting in the way of our ability to connect with our patients, it's making our job harder. And that's kind of the whole point of the podcast is like, as the other human in the room, how can I clean up my side of the patient encounter so that I'm as clear and understanding and opening? And so I have ears to listen and a brain that's focused on their problem. And so how do we navigate what they bring to us when they've done their own research ahead of time? And the first thing that is acknowledging the reality that they're definitely going to do that just like assume all patients would possibly do that, right? Okay. And so then we get to what do we do in the room with the patient? So the first thing I always want to do, and is kind of honestly the most critical thing, is understanding why the patient Googled. And so if we need to explore the why more, and I do encourage us to do it explicitly with the patient, my favorite questions come from the patient-centered clinical method, the FIFE questions. If you had training in Canada and family medicine recently, you may be aware. So those stand for feelings, ideas, function, and expectations. And just as a reminder, I always have a written outline of this. So don't feel like you need to memorize anything I'm saying explicitly. If you want to also read along or have the written version of this podcast, you always can do it. It will be in the show notes. And so the questions being, okay, so like, how are you feeling about what you researched? Or how are you feeling about your symptoms that led you to want to do more research on your own? And almost all the time, it's that they're worried, that they were anxious, that they were curious, maybe. So they're like, I was just curious, but like, I want to know what you think. Like sometimes they are not actually anxious at all, but whether they're anxious or not, whether it's really a fear-based reason that they've done their research or a more curious reason or a more antagonistic reason, like whatever it is, that's really useful to know. So you can then frame how the rest of the dynamic and conversation is going to go with them, right? So that's the feelings one. Ideas, I mean, the classic version of this is, what ideas do you have about what could be going on? And so, I mean, literally, if they've done their research, their internet research, they have ideas. That's what they brought. So it's slight modifications. So something like, so tell me, like, based on your research, what ideas did you see there that you're wondering if it could be? It actually makes that question a lot more open because obviously they've already wanted to have their own ideas and are bringing them to me, right? The function question, maybe this one is a little less relevant now that I think of it. I just always include all the 5 ones together. But, for function, it could be, what is your level of functioning day to day of your symptoms? And is that part of the reason why you decided to do some research about it, right? And it often is, like, it feeds back into that feelings. And then expectations, again, so based on your research, based on what you saw from your research, how are you expecting that I will help you with this? All of those are so rich and so useful. They anchor the reason the patient has come to you. And they're the hugest time saver questions as well, by the way, because they will just allow you to focus the way that the encounter goes based on what the patient is already wanting to begin with, right? And usually what happens is that they have done their research because they are worried about their health, right? And that means that they care about their health. So that's where I like, especially if they have said, either way, honestly, whether they've said, I know you're mad at me because I Googled, or if they don't say that at all, I like to name, I'm never mad at a patient who cares enough about their health to do their own research. Now, that's something I feel comfortable naming because I really believe it's true. If you don't quite believe that's true, and if it doesn't feel honest to do it, then, whatever version of it, you can still acknowledge it's like, what? So what I'm hearing is that you've done research on your own and you have some ideas that you've brought to me and some things you're hoping I can help you with you. I want to acknowledge, like, that means that you care about your health. That means that you are invested enough in your health to do your own research. And that matters. That's amazing. That's so useful. That means that when we make a plan together, it's more likely you're going to follow through, right? I often will say, like, There's some people who come to me and it seems like they don't care about changing things in their health at all. And that's not you. You do care about your health. And so trying to acknowledge like the things that are the benefits about them caring enough about their health to do research on their own, right? And so if that feels really hard to do and almost feels like you're giving something up, just notice that, rewind to the beginning of this podcast and explore more some of the reasons why this feels so hard for you. I even have a whole previous episode of the podcast called Medical Expert Pressure that you might want to like listen to again or go back and listen to, that just talks about some of the reasons why this feels hard, where it feels like you need to be defending your position. And so then acknowledging or even thanking the patient for doing research feels wrong. Just like really notice that and maybe spend some time in that other episode reflecting on some reasons why that might be true for you, and asking yourself if those reasons and that reaction of feeling like you have to defend yourself as an expert, if it's serving you or not, right? If it's serving you, go for it. Then I don't know, but I don't know if everything that I'm about to say will serve you as well. Maybe. I hope that you still find something useful in the podcast. Okay, so that's what I usually say. It's like that's how I like name it in the room with the patient. I say, I am glad you care enough about your health to do your research. Even if I'm not necessarily saying I'm glad you went on those websites and found whatever you found, but I'm still glad that they care enough about their health and in order to take action. That's amazing. That's something we're going to use and hopefully help direct in a way that will produce good results for them, right? Okay, so the third thing to talk about is that possibility of anchoring bias, like I'd mentioned before, and how to prevent it. So first and foremost, it's just remembering it's a thing. So especially since I've had that encounter with that one patient where I noticed how anchoring bias really possibly shifted the outcome for the patient. I will never know for sure, but it is possible because I know I got quite anchored on it being the same thing coming back again. And so internally in my mind, taking that step back and saying, okay, it really could be this, make a note of it, write it down in your notes, but then step back. What else could it be? Whether it's during that patient or afterwards, like if you've gotten caught up in being anchored afterwards, taking a minute to reflect. Is there any other questions that I wish I'd ask? Can I email the patient? Can I bring them back in? Like whatever, like it's not too late. Like let's make sure we thought broad enough, as well as understanding that the patient's idea could be what's going on, right? And then the other thing I started to do, especially if the patient is really focused on, especially if they're really focused on a specific test or a specific treatment. So they're already in like assessment and plan in my SOAP note, but I really still do need to do my subjective objective part just to even double check, right? I have found naming it for the patient helps them understand that I'm not trying to talk them out or avoid the conversation of ordering the MRI or not, or prescribing that medication or not. But it lets them know what I need in order to help fill out the rest of the encounter. So I say something like this: sounds like you have some really good ideas about what might be going on. It is helpful for me to still hear the whole story in case I hear something that gives me a clue that something else or different could be happening. Or so say they've come in, they're like, I need an MRI for my back. So I usually say like, I definitely will order this MRI for your back if it seems like it's going to serve the picture best. The way I know if it's going to serve the picture best is if I hear the whole story first. And trust me, I order MRIs on backs all the time. Like I will order this MRI for you. And I will order this MRI for you if it fits. And the way we will know it fits, and if it's a safe test and a correct test and a test that's going to actually help you and it'll be worth your time, is if I first understand what's going on. So tell me more about what's going on. And then we flip back to the S and O part of our SOAP note conversation, right? It also teaches it's a teaching moment for the patient. Like, hey, our job together is for you to give me all the facts of what's going on in your life. And if you want the best care for me, help me take care of this brain that has knowledge, that has the access to the care you want. Like, let's work on taking care of my brain so I can think best for you. I do that with a lot of things. Like, that's how I explain why I take notes. Like, this helps me keep organized. So I'm going to take notes and type down as you talk, just so you know why I'm doing it. And it makes it clear that I'm not, doing something and not having the patient in mind. It's what I'm doing, with this asking them further questions isn't questioning their initial idea. It's actually helping to support if their initial idea is useful, right? So hopefully that helps, the anchoring bias. So the two things, just as a mini recap: acknowledging it for myself and just knowing it's a thing, and then saying out loud to the patient, this sounds like a really good idea, and I need to hear more to understand other ideas that we could be having. Maybe there's other tests as well. You see, just like giving lots of space so it's not a fight, lots of space. Like there might be even other ideas, even tests that are even better than the MRI that we could find out by me hearing the story. And so you're partnering with them to figure out the problem, right? Okay, so step number 4 is what to do if you actually come to the same conclusion that the patient came to when they did their research. Take time to celebrate these. That's my main advice about these ones. So they literally saved you so much time or energy. It might not feel that way. Be like, no, I had to do the whole thing with the anchoring bias. That's more time. But no, you will not have to convince this patient of the diagnosis or management plan at all. You will not have to do any of that teaching. Like maybe just a quick review to make sure it matches, but like I almost never have to teach people about rotator cuff anymore. It's a random one, but I noticed that like, Google does a good job apparently of helping people understand rotator cuff injuries because they come in like, oh yeah, I've heard about it. Yeah, I know there's I know I'm probably going to do physio. Like it's fascinating. That research just really helps. So I don't have to give them a handout. I'm just like, oh, you already know. So we've saved time now. They did it for you. They were a partner in their care in a way that serves you and helps you save time and energy yourself as the clinician, right? Because our brain only wants to focus on the examples where like Dr. Google slows us down. And I'm going to get into those in a moment, right? But they definitely happen. But like, I want to also make sure that we're intentional about savoring and celebrating the times when it works in our favor, including with our patients. Because like it might feel like, oh, I shouldn't encourage them to research. Maybe next time it will be researched wrong. But the thing is, like, this patient clearly has enough internet savvy to research to places that were reputable enough that it gave them the right answer, right? Like, this isn't necessarily behavior we want to dissuade, right? We've taught them about the anchoring bias, so to help prevent it from being actually a hazard or a risk, but we don't want to dissuade them from doing it again. It saved us time and energy. I don't know if you know this, but we don't have enough people in healthcare to continue to serve all the people who need our care. I know that seems like I just feel like for sure that's true. We want patients, for example, to Google and care for their own colds, right? Like there's things that sometimes patients come in for us where like, I feel like definitely you never have to come in with this, this wart, this benign mole. Like there's things where once you've assessed it and you've reasserted them, that could be good. But like, when people come in for things where you're like, this is something you can treat yourself, that like you don't need any of my prescriptions. It's more like teaching and empowering the patient to do it for themselves. And so if a piece of that is them doing their own research, let's encourage that and celebrate that. And internally for us to celebrate that as a win, because it will help our brain. This is important because it will also help our brain to recognize that Dr. Google isn't always the evil enemy. Sometimes he can be. I think of him as a male. I don't know Google's gender, but like, really, sorry, me gendering Google just totally distracted me. I apologize. What am I trying to say? Yes. Oftentimes they come in, they say, I've done my research, and we get a sinking reaction, right? So this will help combat it from being so sinking and getting so defensive right off the bat. If we recognize there are times when it's very useful. So instead of getting that sinking, defensive, irritated reaction, we can stay more neutral and get curious. Is this going to be one of the times where Google helps us? Or is this going to be one of those times where now we have to like do some extra legwork around how the patient has been anchored around an idea of their health that doesn't match mine, right? So we don't have to get reactive right off the jump. We can get curious and see what's going on. And then later we can work on if the patient actually, now we're at a point of disagreement with the patient and what we can do with that. Okay, so we have to savor the good ones, savor the ones where it actually helped us. That will help us to stop having that really initial defensive reaction. All right. So savoring those. And then there are the times where you have heard, oh, I've done my research, and you've asked them why. So you now understand why they Google. You understand that they're anxious about their care, and you've done all that beautiful acknowledgement. You have made sure anchoring bias hasn't swayed your ability to assess a situation independent of what Google said, right? So you've done all those things. And unfortunately, this is one of the cases where now, in part thanks to Google, but also beyond Google, the patient has a very specific belief around what they think is happening in their body that is not matching your assessment of the situation. And so now we're having a bit of possible conflict, possible disagreement. And as we said up front, that's one of the reasons that we can really struggle with these, is because that's hard for a lot of us. It is a really important part of our job is to understand how to disagree well with our patients, though. And so Dr. Google can serve as a really rich reason how to do it. So I'm going to do let's see, how many steps does this have in here? Like a 4-step process. Probably this also needs its own episode, though. Hey, now that I think of it, of like what to do when we disagree with patients. But I'm going to give you what I got here. And then on a future episode, I might flesh it out a little more. So if you come to different conclusions, and so now you're in a potential disagreement situation. So the first thing to do is let them have their beliefs, right? So a bunch of time trying to explain the evidence and the data and the science. I don't know if you've noticed, for example, with the COVID-19 vaccine example, not typically effective if the patient really has come in and they are firm on their belief. If a patient's like, I've done some research and I'm scared about it and I just really want to know what you think, perfect. They actually haven't formed a belief yet. They're not sure. And now you can come in and offer your perspective on it. And then they will decide. They may decide no, they may decide yes, but you're going to contribute what you know, right? But in a case where when saying I've done my research is like, no, I just really need this very specific test. I need this very elaborate thyroid panel because my naturopath said I needed, or this person on the internet said I needed, my, whoever it was, right? So they are coming and they are firm and they are fighting for their belief. That is not typically someone that we're going to be able to shift in the room. And it definitely won't shift if we really are just trying to convince them that they're wrong. Because if someone's being told they're wrong, they are feeling judged, and then they usually double down, right? And so one way to just clear that up in your brain, because like sometimes our brains just get reactive, like, how can it be that this patient has such a different idea than me? The thing I always remind my own brain of is that some people believe the earth is flat. There are people out there that really believe that. They form their whole life around that. And just like people who believe the earth is flat, like basically it just helps my brain to sort of zoom out and say, people believe all sorts of things that some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. And I don't have control over what other people believe. There's all sorts of interesting, wild things out there. And so with this patient in the room, the fact that they believe something different isn't something that has to be a threat to me, because there's just all sorts of ideas out there, so it just helps give it space around it. The only way you could start based on, behavioral science, the only way you could start to change their mind over time is actually by accepting and offering a kind of as much respect as you can to their position now, and not make it mean something bad about them or about you. So if the fact that they really believe something bad about whatever now means something bad about you, you're never going to be able to convince them. I noticed that a lot, because I felt a lot of pressure when the COVID vaccine was rolling out to convince every single patient, because we were getting a lot of messages about doctors, you have the best relationships with your patients, you can convince them all. And then I would feel all this pressure to be like a salesperson for the vaccine in ways that ended up probably feeling very judgy and pressury for my patients. It was one of the things that really burnt me out, to be honest. And so now I just understand better how brains work. So for patients where they come in and they're like, I've done my research, there's no way, it's poison in my body, I don't spend a lot of time convincing them. I may ask them questions or hear more about why that opinion matters to them, but I actually leave it very open, and therefore have the possibility of relationship. So if later on they're starting to have their own doubts or questions, they know I'm a safe person they can come to explore those, and that I won't clamp down on them and be like, see, you were wrong, see, you were bad, right? So just letting them have their own beliefs about that they need the thyroid stuff, that they need the fancy test that you don't think they need. Let them have that. It doesn't change what you're going to do, but you can let them have it. And when I say let them have it, I just mean acknowledge the fact that you don't have control over what they believe anyway, right? The second thing is checking your own biases. Like, do you have a good why not in this case? Or are you mostly don't like that it feels like the patient is ordering you to do something and you want to be the boss, right? Like, one question I always double check, because like sometimes patients come in and the way that they're asking feels yucky. It feels like they're ordering you around. You feel like probably the same way that people in the service industry, like, waiters and servers, when people are just like so dismissive and like don't even treat them like a person, they just treat you like I was saying, like McDonald's medicine's a term I hear where people, it's like, okay, I want these 5 tests and these 5 treatments, give them to me now, please. And you feel like, yeah, like I'm a person, like, hey, I have stuff to assess you for, and you're not really the boss of me, right? Then it gets all like that. So one question to help combat that is, if you had thought of it first, would it have seemed reasonable? If a specialist had requested for you to do it, would that have been reasonable? Like, is some of what they're asking at least reasonable? And yes, the way that they're asking, and we use words like entitled or bossy or demanding, or like these words that feel, when it feels like it's all coming at us, those might be there in the room, but like really what they're asking, is there something in what they're asking for that is reasonable? And can we like put our own sort of biases aside and saying, what's reasonable here? Because that's step 3. What, if anything, can you agree on? Common ground is so critical, right? Like, there's so much benefit in finding common ground and saying yes to things that maybe you wouldn't have never have suggested because you don't think they are like 100% necessary. They're not your usual approach. They're not your style, but they are reasonable. Like, a reasonable clinician may offer it in this case. Is it likely to come back positive? Probably not. But is it reasonable? First of all, because it will foster trust with this patient, leaves room for negotiation. And also, you can't know 100% if you're right or not, right? So like they're right, as in you don't know yet what's going on either. So it also helps you to stop yourself from anchoring against what they're asking for because they asked for it, right? So just like what seems reasonable is like a thing I think a lot. Understanding there's a lot of ways to practice medicine, right? And so the example, so say a really classic one that happens quite often is either they have done a Google or have a practitioner like a naturopath who's like, I need to order these 5 thyroid tests. But my training where I am is that you do not need all 5, that all 5 are unnecessary. And especially I'm in a public healthcare system, so it does actually have cost behind it. So like, I will potentially order the one, like the TSH, like one thyroid test. Does it seem likely it's going to come back abnormal? Maybe not. Have I ordered it sometime in the past for them? Yeah. But has it been a somewhat reasonable amount of time? Have their symptoms changed a reasonable amount? Like they're that much more fatigued or whatever. And so is it reasonable that possibly the thyroid could be involved? Sure. So I'm going to order the test, the piece of what they've come in with their list that does make sense, right? Because then I can say this to them, right? So it's like, so I will order this test for you. You do have symptoms that overlap with a thyroid condition. And I know you read online and you're really wondering if your thyroid being off is the answer for the reason that you're so tired, you're so fatigued, your brain's so foggy, right? And alongside ordering this thyroid test, I have more things that I have and ideas to offer you. Can we explore your sleep? Can we explore your mental health? And could we also consider if those are contributing to your fatigue? So if you just say no, then it shuts their brain down too. But you have ideas probably about what's going on beyond what they've initially brought in. And so by saying yes and as best you can to their request, that leaves room for the patient to consider you. Versus if you're like, I am not ordering anything you read off the internet. And instead, you definitely are just depressed and that's it. Like, say you presented it that way, the patient's just going to be like, bye. Like, they're not going to listen to you at all, right? Because you shut them down, so they're going to shut you down. So how can you have common ground to explore and say yes and with your patient, right? How much kind of give, understanding that it's not, you're not hoarding things, like there's not so much really giving up, but what is reasonable for you to say yes to, right? And then the last step is offering a loving no to the rest. Not making it mean anything about you, not making it mean anything bad about your patient, that they've said, hey, can you do this for me? And you say no. Like, really, they said words to you, you said words back is one way to view what happened in that situation, right? So one way that I sort of soften my no, and I make the no easier for me to say, as well as oftentimes easier for the patient to hear, is I name it as my difference in perspective. I often use my training as sort of a way to externalize. So I'm not saying that they're bad for asking. I'm naming something else, which is, from my training, this is not a test. And so it just helps to create a bit of space and distance so that the patient can hear the no without feeling judged for being rejected, which is often how they feel. Because when we ask for something, especially if we were vulnerable to ask, maybe been wanting to ask it for a while, we really think it's going to help. And now the person saying no, that feels like total rejection and judgment, even if it's not meant that way, right? So this is a way to kind of externalize, you know what? These aren't tasks that I have training or expertise in ordering. So I hear that you really want them, but I'm not the doctor that will be able to, I don't have the training to order and interpret them correctly. So it's not something that I would do for you. According to my training, this is not a treatment that's indicated or recommended. It doesn't have safety data, whatever, right? But again, just sort of, it helps to externalize, as instead of saying you're wrong for asking, right? And if underneath you are feeling that sort of anger and frustration, it's okay to name that too, sometimes with the patient, but certainly outside of that encounter, just saying like, it's so frustrating that there are these places on the internet that prey on people who are scared about their health. It's so frustrating that there's these places on the internet that prey upon, people feeling helpless or hopeless in life in general. And then there's all these health related conspiracies that are connected, like the whole vaccine thing. It just like, so if you have anger and grief and frustration about this, me too, by the way, that's valid to have those. And to understand that those are separate from your patient is also really important. So just like I said, separate, I'm not doing this, not because I think you're a bad person. So like as a clinician, I'm not denying you this test because you're bad for asking. I'm denying you this test because my training says no. Same with your patient. So your patient is asking for this request, not because they are a bad person, but especially when it comes to all these conspiracy theories, they were vulnerable and they have bought into a set of ideas that don't match your own. And it's fine if you're angry and frustrated and feel like it's getting in their way, but you don't have to be angry and frustrated at them. You can be angry and frustrated at the ideas and at the people who are preying on them and manipulating them into what, in your opinion, is blocking them from care that could be helpful to them, right? And you can acknowledge the reasons why, if you have, if you've had this full conversation and now have an understanding of why they want to believe those things, why they went looking for those kinds of answers, why that kind of research and why those Google articles appealed to them most. I can't imagine how scary it is to believe that you can't get blood transfusions because they might have spike proteins. Like, what's it like for you to feel like, so much of healthcare is out to get you, like the big pharma is, that must make it really hard to access care. Like if you have mental energy and you have that connection with the patient, acknowledging that for them. So if nothing else, they can feel a little more understood, even if you're not going to be able to give them some of what they're asking for. And if they're open, you can always give them websites that have non-predatory quality information, right? Especially for people who are just trying to sort out where to find answers for common things. That's another really great way of narrowing down their Google search. But as I said, I'd say that's I said that at the end because it is useful only if you have an understanding of if they're interested in having that discussion with you. Otherwise, it's really more about, do we agree or disagree about the ideas you've brought in the room? And if we agree, we can celebrate. If we disagree, we can still celebrate what we have as common ground. We can still celebrate that you cared enough to come to me. You care enough about your health to come and advocate for your health based on this research. I am not giving it to you because it is not what my training and what my assessment says you need, but I'm still able to celebrate that you did that, whether you want to hear that from me or not, right? So, really, I hope this whole episode has helped you see there's always a way to partner with your patient and use their Googling to strengthen your relationship, or at least offer a way for them to strengthen. It is totally understandable and valid, emotionally speaking, for your patient to feel frustrated if you do say no to them. And so if they want to end the relationship, whatever, like that's up to them, right? But you can always feel good about what you offer to your patients, which is that understanding and connection to them. Google does not have to be a barrier to doing that. Okay, so that's what I have for you today. So a couple reflections and takeaways to consider. So one thing right now is to ask yourself, what is one example of a time when the patient Googling and doing their own research made my job easier? And try and think of those as often as possible, just to help reduce that initial defensive negative reaction that we often feel as soon as someone says the word Google in the room. Because like I said, it can be really, really useful, or it can be harder, right? So it could be either. So let's get curious, lean in, gain more understanding about this situation before our brains and bodies have to have that emotional judgment and block us, right? That's number one. And the second question I have for you is, what's one thing that you've heard in what I've just shared with you that you're going to try the next time someone's patient's Googled research seems to get in the way of you doing your job? How are you going to use one of the tips or tools that I've just suggested to help make this easier for you? Because this exists, it is part of our jobs now, and it doesn't have to be the thing that burns us out and sinks us. I think that the reasons that this can burn us out, honestly, are mostly about the fact that we feel devalued or disrespected. And if we let that go and find a way to partner with the patient and acknowledge that the reason they're doing that research is because they care about their health, I think that the whole Dr. Google thing can work to our advantage every single time, even if sometimes it makes the conversation go in a different direction than we initially planned. All right. So I hope that was helpful. Let me know on social media or wherever you want. And I'll see you next time. Bye.